Okay. Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
Even Alan. Good afternoon, and welcome to this presentation and panel discussion on enacting climate justice. My name is Sibel Shattuck. I'm a member of the faculty here at Western Michigan University with a joint appointment between the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability and the Department of Comparative Religion. I'd like to extend a special welcome to the people who are here in the WMU Center for the Humanities. It's nice to be in one room together, but also to those who are joining us virtually. It's wonderful we can have panelists in California joining us here in Michigan so we can have this rich conversation. I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. We'd like to recognize that Western Michigan University is located on lands historically occupied by the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations. Let us take a moment to acknowledge and honor this ancestral land of the Three Fires Confederacy, and to honor the sacred lands of all Indigenous peoples and their continued presence. This event today was organized by the WMU Center for the Humanities and the WMU Climate Change Working Group. A few years ago, the Climate Change Working Group began a Climate Change Fellows program to provide support for faculty who want to incorporate climate change into their courses. This year's cohort is actually sponsored by a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, with a special emphasis on increasing engagement with climate change in humanities and social science courses here at WMU. So our audience today includes faculty from anthropology and geography and, one atmospheric chemist. But people, and English and psychology. So we have a wide range of people who are now engaging with this, because we recognize that climate change isn't just a matter of science. It's about policy, it's about cultural values, it's about communication, it's about the stories we tell. And we need to really help our students engage in all of these different fields. And of course, we as faculty need to engage in this because it affects all of our lives. During the fall semester, as a cohort of Humanities Climate Fellows was engaging in lively discussions about the readings and videos that were part of our program, environmental justice kept coming up as a theme that they all cared deeply about. And that's what led to the creation of today's panel discussion. And we hope that during this discussion, we are going to learn about climate justice issues and how they can be incorporated into state and local policy, what opportunities there are for people in all different walks of life to engage in helping to address these issues, and also to have a chance to think about how we as educators can create programs that help prepare our students so they can contribute to climate justice goals. Let me introduce our wonderful panel today. We have Dr. Michael Mendez, who is joining us from Irvine, California. He's an assistant professor of environmental planning and policy at the University of California at Irvine, my natal state. He's also an Andrew Carnegie Fellow and a visiting scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. In addition to his academic work, he has more than a decade of experience in public and private sector policy work, including having served as a senior consultant for the California State Legislature and as vice chair of the Sacramento City Planning Commission. His recent book, Climate Change from the Streets, describes the challenges of incorporating environmental justice into global and state climate change policy by exploring the efforts of low-income people of color to influence climate change policies in California. The book has received numerous awards, including the Harold and Margaret Sprout Award from the International Studies Association and the Betty and Alfred McClung Lee Book Award from the Association for Humanist Sociology. His current research is looking at climate-induced disasters and social vulnerability, with particular attention to the disparate impacts of extreme wildfire events on undocumented Latinx and Indigenous migrants. And that research is being supported by a National Science Foundation Early Career Faculty Award. Since we're talking about education, I wanted to mention that All three of our panelists have Bachelor of Arts degrees. Some people think you've got to have a science degree to work with the environment. Dr. Mendez has a BA from California State University at Northridge, a master's degree in urban studies and planning from MIT, and he received his PhD from UC Berkeley's Department of City and Regional Planning. And here in Michigan, we are joined by Ms. Regina Strong, who leads the Office of the Environmental Justice Public Advocate for the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, which most of us prefer to call EGLE. As public advocate, she leads the state's interagency environmental justice response team, and she established the Michigan Advisory Council on Environmental Justice. For more than 30 years, Ms. Strong has been a leader in public affairs, advocacy, and the fight for justice and equity, working with organizations such as the Sierra Club, where she directed the Michigan Beyond Coal campaign, and she was the executive director for an organization called Community Development Advocates of Detroit. She also has a Bachelor of Arts degree from MSU and a Master of Science in Strategic Communication from Purdue University. And our third panelist, Ms. Michelle Martinez, is the inaugural director of the Tishman Center for Social Justice and the Environment at the University of Michigan School of Environment and Sustainability. So she's bringing her years of experience in the community to bear on developing an educational program for master's students. And she's well suited to do that because she has 15 years of experience practicing environmental justice in her hometown of Detroit. Prior to her current job, she served as executive director of the Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition, which she helped start. She's still on the board there and works with other local organizations such as We the People, which also have strong EJ emphases. She too has a Bachelor of Arts degree in English and a Master of Science in Environmental Policy and Planning from the University of Michigan. So I know we're going to have an extraordinary conversation today with these three panelists. And we'd like to begin with Dr. Michael Mendez and his presentation from his research out in California.
Thank you so much for this kind of invitation and for reaching out to me in the first place over the last couple of months to ensure that this panel happens and have these amazing co-panelists on this, that we're going to have an engaging and a productive conversation around climate action and issues of equity and environmental justice. So thank you. And thank you to the WMU for hosting this important event. In the aspect of ensuring that we have a constructive dialogue and more of a conversation, I'm cutting my presentation time in half. So I'll be presenting about 15 to 18 minutes. And that way that the three of us, along with our moderator, will have enough time to talk to the audience and answer questions. So let me just go ahead and share my screen. And I'm glad you opened up the discussion about climate change is not just about science or abstract science, but about this notion that it's about politics. It's about understanding that climate change happens in larger society, and it's about communication, stories, and narratives, as you mentioned, or what I call a lot in my work about climate change worldviews. And so what you're seeing here is a flyer that an environmental justice organization in Oakland, in West Oakland, California. So this is in the San Francisco Bay Area. Oakland's majority people of color city, and it's across the bay from San Francisco, and it has a historic reputation of being a center of social justice issues, including the founding of the Black Panthers, and some of our school cafeteria programs was initiated first in Oakland, California, and is also leading the way on environmental issues. So what we're looking at here is this flyer from 2010, which really wanted to decenter that worldview that climate change is about abstract ideas, about climate change out there in the wilderness, away from people, away from cities, away from communities, away from our backyards, and away from our streets. And really try to decenter that concept about it's not just about polar bears. So that might be a saying that was very overused now, but back then it was something that was really held to a symbol of what climate change meant, about polar bears, melting ice caps, and not about communities or people. So this particular group, the Oakland Climate Action Coalition, was really trying to argue that it's not just about polar bears. Climate justice is also about youth and the future of Oakland. And look how they spell youth. This event was targeted to the youth population, but youth is emphasized as people, Y-O-U, at an individual, and trying to do people-centered. And one of the key environmental justice advocates from West Oakland told me, up until the last decade, climate change tended to be this white affluent issue about saving the rainforest and polar bears. It hasn't had deep relevance for people trying every day to get by in the urban centers. Most of the messages of climate change are about eliminating global greenhouse gas emissions and not about people. So 10, 20 years ago, when California first entered into the climate action arena, there was a strong schism, conflict, and fights around what climate change meant, how we conceptualized it. Did it include people? More importantly, did it include low-income people of color that are at front lines of disproportionate impacts from existing pollution and carbon pollution? So in California, keeping this in mind, we need to really think about creating representative messages and symbols, particularly because we are experiencing a major climate change crisis and a historic racial unrest at the same time. In the last several years, millions of people have been impacted by multiple disasters, fires, blackouts, heat waves, drought, hazardous air quality, flooding, most recently, and of course, the ever-present COVID-19 pandemic. These are all major life events, and these compounding of disasters have cascading health, social, and economic impacts. And due to existing structural inequalities, these impacts are disproportionately affecting low-income people of color. So in my book, I set to trace the history of decentering abstract notions of polar bears, wilderness being, climate change happening out in the wilderness, and how it's people-centered and a people movement around climate action and climate justice. Many of you know, to address the climate emergency, activists and policymakers have proposed the Green New Deal at the federal level, a radical proposal to decarbonize our economy and address poverty and inequality. However, for the last 2 decades, low-income communities of color have also pushed state and local governments to experiment in reducing greenhouse gas emissions and approaches that also address inequality and public health. These efforts in climate experimentation have been contentious and are often met with significant resistance. While I'm supportive of the Green New Deal, I'm here to say that there's nothing new about the Green New Deal. Climate change experiments in places like California since 2004 have been all-out street fights. Environmental justice activists are often pitted against traditional environmentalists who favor the least costly mitigation solutions, which do not necessarily maximize equity and public health outcomes in low-income communities of color. These conflicts over climate change are cultural at their core. They illustrate that although the science about climate change is clear, policy decisions about how to respond to its effects remain contentious. Even when such decisions are claimed to be guided by objective knowledge, they are made and implemented through political institutions and relationships, and all the competing interests, power, and racial struggles that this implies. So if we look towards the example of California, it reveals the contingent nature of climate change policy, the assumptions and social, political, and cultural attitudes that often create conflict between community understandings of local environmental conditions and the prevailing global top-down conceptualization of climate change. In California, tensions between different approaches to addressing climate change are often centered on the politics of scale, economics, class, and race. These differences in worldviews, if unacknowledged, can lead to the breakdown of trust, even among groups that are nominally working towards the same goal, reducing the harm that climate change would do to human societies and our planet. So again, for insight into national level conflicts between groups working on climate change solutions, one should look towards a nearly 2-decade California experiment of incorporating environmental justice and health equity principles into climate change policies. For environmental justice activists in California, the main threat from climate change is the disproportionate harm it causes to their bodies and the health of their communities. For them, climate change is not just about global greenhouse gas models, rather it is also about the opposing worldviews to which policy and science is seen. Yet in California, it is still often seen as a homogeneous, the state of California is often seen as this homogeneous entity that uniformly values environmentalism and climate action. This image universalizes the idea of climate change and detaches it from its cultural settings. It also obscures how the localization of environmental policy and science within the state involves processes of public consultation and legitimacy. For example, in this recent book from a major university press, it describes itself as the definitive book on California's environmental history, from the founding of Yosemite, John Muir, to modern climate change policy regimes. However, in this nearly 300-page book, people of color are only mentioned 3 times, and it's really done in passing. So there's this traditional environmental narrative of California that facilitates the erasure of people of color and enacting comprehensive environmental policy and leadership. Therefore, I published my book through Yale University Press, Climate Change from the Streets, with the explicit focus on people of color. My book foregrounds people, place, and power in the context of climate change and inequality. Moreover, this research is originated in my public policy work for the California State Legislature during a 15-year period. This provided me valuable insight into how the interactions of governments, businesses, and NGOs shape climate change policy. My research is further influenced by my experience growing up in Latino immigrant communities of Los Angeles that face multiple environmental threats. As a youth in places like Pacoima, Sylmar, and Lakeview Terrace, I was surrounded by people resisting environmental racism. Whether protesting the siting of landfills or organizing to demand the cleanup of toxic properties, they sought to understand how these situations originated, to develop alternatives, and to imagine new environmental futures. Therefore, this has focused my work on what the conceptualization of environmental justice and climate change has meant to activists, policymakers, experts, and scholars alike. Moreover, this experience is also embodied through my lived experience. I was part of a voluntary school busing program. This is similar to maybe what you heard about Vice President Kamala Harris talking about being Berkeley in a mandatory school busing program in the 60s. This was, of course, in the 90s and later on, where my mother wanted me to find additional, better educational opportunities. So she put me in a voluntary school busing program that was aimed to integrate schools, particularly in the San Fernando Valley, which many of you may know as this ideal place where the Brady Bunch lived, or what we think of suburban Americana that was traveled around the world. So I would wake up every morning around 6 o'clock, get to the school bus, come from the Northeast San Fernando Valley, primarily Latino and Black immigrant neighborhood, and see the changes in the valley as it from unpaved streets and sidewalks, lack of street lights, because yes, even in Los Angeles, there's lack of infrastructure, and see the changes in the built environment as I would move down across the valley. I also participated as a worker in my father's bike shop in a low-income community of Pacoima. This was not a fancy bike shop. This was a family-owned store and very low-income clientele. And I would see the sort of challenges, undocumented people lacking licenses, people that didn't have access to a car, couldn't afford a car, couldn't get a driver's license, and were relegated to either taking the bus or using bicycles, and how often the infrastructure was not built for them. They often would be in accidents. Some unfortunately would die and be in various types of inequity. So that really opened up my eyes. So in closing, this embodied a type of research that I engage with, examines new models of engagement in climate change and justice that make space for alternative paradigms of environmental protection. My engagement with stakeholders since 2003 have allowed me to critically analyze how the success of climate change policy in California and beyond now depends on incorporating marginalized voices and embodied perspectives from the local and global scales. I look forward to talking to the university community here, as well as my panelists, on their firsthand perspectives on environmental and racial injustices in Michigan. So I look forward to that. But before I go, I just want to highlight some new research that I am working on beyond the book. So my next major projects have been on climate-induced disasters, particularly communities that are disproportionately discriminated in an existing disaster relief recovery efforts, particularly around stigma issues, such as undocumented Latino Indigenous migrants, and really showing that because of cultural norms of who is a worthy disaster victim, these undocumented migrants are often rendered invisible in the context of public policy and climate adaptation initiatives. And we've had a great showing of being able to present this research focus on wildfires to various policy audiences from the local government, state, national, and even international. The United Nations Migration Agency is really interested in how climate-induced disasters are creating disproportionate amount of impacts to migrant communities, farm workers around the world. And then also want to highlight some other research that we've had done with FEMA, NOAA, and a couple other news site organizations is understanding and exploring how and why LGBT communities are affected legally, psychologically, physically, and even theologically during disasters. Taking again a strong environmental justice lens, really understanding the intersectional approaches to the LGBTQ community that are 40% people of color, large amount of unhoused or housing insecure individuals that confront everyday stigma as well and discrimination in the everyday lives. And when a disaster strikes, those social inequities are only exacerbated during and after a disaster. So again, thank you for this opportunity to talk to you a little bit about a high level thinking and themes from my research, my book, and my current research on climate-induced disasters. Thank you.
So it strikes me it might be really helpful if Regina and Michelle could talk about what they see as some of the primary environmental justice challenges or climate justice challenges here in Michigan, and that might then inform the way our discussion unfolds. So Regina, would you like to start?
Sure, thank you so much. I really enjoyed the previous presentation by Dr. Mendez, because although California and Michigan are on different on different sides of the country, there are some definite similarities in both the struggles and opportunities. So I'll just back up and say the Office of Environmental Justice Public Advocate that I lead is 4 years old. We're in our 5th year. Governor Whitmer created the office when she took office in 2019. And in addition to creating the Office of Environmental Justice Public Advocate, as you mentioned in the intro, also created an advisory, the response team that incorporates the departments across the state, talking monthly since 2019 about environmental justice issues. And why that's so important is it reflects, a lot of what we heard from Michael, that it is not just one area of state government, not just legislative, actions, but all of government kind of working together to address some of the challenges. And I think the impetus for the creation of the Office of Environmental Justice Public Advocate is the unfortunate realities that happened in Flint several years, a few years before Governor Whitmer took office, and we created this office. And out of what happened in Flint in terms of the Flint water crisis, there was a creation of an advisory task force to help the state think about what should come next. And out of that convening, there were 33 recommendations that came. And one of those many recommendations, which kind of reflected decades of advocacy by grassroots and frontline community. And that task force had a combination of frontline community and others as part of the conversation, but spoke, of those 33 recommendations, several of them became the priorities of the creation of this office. It asked for kind of an ombudsman's type of situation to deal with complaints, asked for screening tools, asked for a lot of different ways to address the challenges that were decade old in Michigan. We suffer from our what I call the ghosts of our industrial past and present, right? We in Michigan, this is what we do, right? In addition to that, being a Great Lakes state, as you all know, we're surrounded by water. The delivery of water is a challenge in an aging infrastructure. So when you ask what the priority issues, there are many, from water infrastructure and the prioritizing of clean drinking water to air issues, to, with climate change moving forward, just the things that are impacting communities. And I like the way you said it, Michael. Greenhouse gas emissions aren't on the top of the list of the person whose home just flooded, right? When we have storms, the infrastructure can't handle it. So these are hitting environmental justice communities particularly hard. So the aging infrastructure causes other problems that then are exacerbated in communities of color and low-income communities across the state. So I would say all of those things are at the top of the list. And if you add to that the challenges of the costs of both water and energy, which become a burden for communities. So I think it is really all of those things I mentioned, and I'm sure Michelle will reflect a lot of this in her comments as well, because they're a big part of what not just our office, but advocates on the ground and people living in communities through their lived experience share with us all the time. So I'll hand that over to Michelle and let her continue.
Yeah. Thanks, Regina. So much of that resonates with me, and thank you, Michael, and thank you all, Sibel, for inviting us and for spending the time here today. Yeah, so much of it resonated with me, particularly around the worldviews. That sometimes we find ourselves in environmental justice communities almost speaking an entirely different language around climate. And the way that we talk about climate change much has to do with our relationship to our neighborhoods and our environments and our communities. And that looks different from someone living in Southwest Detroit next to a Marathon Oil or an international bridge or next to a highway, who might be experiencing issues with breathing or cancer, low birth weight, the health impacts, but aren't talking about that like climate, right? Aren't talking about it like greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And so the solutions to those do look very different than a solution that looks explicitly and only at greenhouse gas emissions reduction strategies. So when people come in talking about solutions like buying a new electric stove or, retrofitting the home, which are great solutions, don't exactly add up to immediate benefit for community members who are experiencing a much bigger problem. And I would say that over the last 15 years, my thought about what the problem in Michigan is different, and it's evolved quite a bit. That, when I graduated from graduate school with my policy degree, I said, a great policy is going to fix this, right? That if we can just get it right, we can just write the cumulative impact bill the right way. If we can just follow the democratic channels in the proper way, then we should be able to advance this. But we've learned a lot through the last 10, 15 years about what the issue of political power can do and has done. And I think that's the number one issue of climate change right now, not only in Michigan, but all over the country, is the enormous imbalance of power that the fossil fuel industry has over our lives. I can't get to work. I can't see my mom. I can't buy food without getting in a car and driving. In our politics, the Michigan legislature, a recent report was done where every single Michigan legislature is paid by our utilities, DTE and Consumers Energy, who have spent hundreds of millions of dollars over the last year in political lobbying. So our politics, our everyday lives, and the ways that we can interact with our loved ones actually depends on the political hold that the fossil fuel corporation has, and it limits our choices and it limits our lives. We saw the dramatic and just tragic impacts of the Flint water crisis when economic decisions are made without a democratic process. And that was very much a political issue. It had, of course, health, environmental impacts on our housing, impacts on the entire state, and these things do have solutions. But the political will is sort of harnessed and captured by the fossil fuel industry itself. So my big transition is, hey, you know, a great policy is wonderful, but without organizing and the political will to take back our community power, we're not going to get there.
So I know that one of the emphases that Regina's office has been working on, really in relation to the Healthy Climate Plan here in Michigan, actually has to do with building the capacity for communities to actually engage with the policy process and help shape that, which, as Michelle says, is so central, right? And so I wonder if, since a lot of Mike Mendez's work has actually focused on how the people in California did shape policy in a way, if perhaps we could talk about process and capacity building and what it takes for the environmental justice communities to actually have a good voice. And you all could just take turns answering that.
We can all jump in at once.
Right. You are the people on the ground who've been doing this work, right?
I just wanted to start by saying California set the model when it came to, first they had legislation at a time, I think, when most states did not. Then they created a CalEnviro a screening tool that is the model that states like Michigan and other states, as we, you know, work to create something. There's a really important intersection of my work and Michelle's work, in that when she was with Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition, she worked with the University of Michigan and some grad students to say, if Michigan had a screening tool, what would it look like?
Yeah. And could you just explain what a glorious screening tool we now have and what it does? Because there are people here who've probably never seen it.
Okay, so I'll start by this little bit of history about it, because I think it's relevant to the development of it. But, you know, when we talk about a screening tool, it is really a GIS-based data map that shows, you know, it is, you know, what we've developed at this point is census tract based, and it shows things like environmental sites across the state, along with other socioeconomic things that communities face. And it is based on the CalEnviro screen model. And kind of the story I was telling about Michelle and the graduate students who worked to provide this model, that model helped us once I got into this office, look at a model to collaborate both what we received from California and the research there, and what could happen in Michigan to create a Michigan specific tool. We've been working on it for 2.5 years. And it is still in this draft form, although draft is coming off real soon. But really to take a look at how we identify what communities face, very localized to Michigan. Because I think one of the challenges that you hear from all of us, I think, is there's the policy and the data and here are the environmental sites, here are here where coal plants are, here where other sites are, landfills, things like that. And then what are the lived experiences of the people who live near those? And how do you correlate that information? And I call it singing from the same song sheet. So whether you are in a community trying to figure out how the context of what you're facing every day, whether you're at a university, whether you're a local government, whether you're a company, whether you're state or federal, how do you all look at the same information and make decisions? And so the tool is designed for us in Michigan to be a resource and to help us move the conversation about things like cumulative impact, things like resources to community forward. And I think that's the critical piece. Although The landscape of support for these kind of things has changed politically here recently. It has been, challenging to get to where we are now. So I think we're at an exciting space and place to even have this tool in Michigan. So I think it's going to play an important role, but it'll be one tool of many that folks can use to tell a more complete story about how to move things forward.
Great. I think that's a great synopsis of sort of the state of the field of what's going on. But I'd like to highlight that what's going on in California obviously is not perfect. And I want to be very clear. I don't speak about the environmental justice outcomes, rose-tinted glasses. There's considerable tension still and issues that need to be addressed and here in 2023, but there has been some progress. And I really try to highlight in the subtitle of the book, from conflict to collaboration, that how these environmental justice groups over 2 decades have used oppositional tactics, from protesting to filing lawsuits to sponsoring their own legislation to doing sit-ins at the chair of the air board in front of their house, to actually having an inside-outside campaign of putting key environmental justice advocates within the governor's office on regulatory boards and commissions, having full-time lobbyists in the state capitol from the environmental justice organizations. So it was a succession of tactics, both from oppositional, conflict-driven to now collaborative, that are moving the needle a little bit forward. And I think Regina really mentioned about that task force that they established in Michigan, that it was really after decades of advocacy that task force came. And that's why I had that slide. No disrespect to Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, but we really need to acknowledge that environmental justice groups, community-based organizations at the ground level have been doing this for 20 years, well before anyone knew what a Green New Deal is. So I try to be very explicit that these advocacies, these tactics, these movements, these people-led movements have been around for a long time and predate the Green New Deal. And this idea of having moving away from what I call in my own book, carbon reductionism, really this myopic focus or fundamentalist focus on just carbon, or fetish of just carbon mitigation, and not really understanding that fossil fuels, the burning of fossil fuels creates other co-pollutants of climate change that stay at the local level, that affect people's health, that need to be addressed simultaneously with climate change and not have this bifurcation. One of the biggest fights in California in the early 2000s was bifurcation of global air policy from local air policy, and really arguing that all they cared was about global emissions, and that we had existing regulatory frameworks to deal with local pollution. But as many of you know, those existing regulatory frameworks were inadequate for many communities of color, low-income communities as well. So to really understand that all the money, all the staff resources, and creation of new programs were going at the air board in particular, was going away from the original mission of local air quality and public health protection to this global air pollution regime, and siphoning away money away from local communities and enforcement. So I just really want to highlight that, and this movement of co-benefits and multi-benefit climate change policy that community groups all over the nation wanted to do. And I just want to highlight one quote from one of the key environmental justice advocates that were arguing for this cow and viral screen. It took 15 years actually to get the cow and viral screen, because as you know, special interest polluters were lobbying for many, many years to not get this adopted by regulatory agencies, OEHA, which is the environmental assessment agency there, until EJ groups started to sponsor their own legislation. The demographics of the legislature itself changed from being primarily white and male to being Latino, Asian, and African-American legislators coming from environmental justice communities. These legislators, we call them the Tri-Caucus, started to withhold their legislative votes on major environmental bills, So these were bills NRDC, EDF were sponsoring, and the legislators of color started to say, we're not voting for these bills. We're going to kill these bills unless you start enacting EJ provisions or center these communities first. So I just want to read a quote real quick, and I'll be quiet. Quote, we were asked by policymakers, what is environmental justice and where are these areas? For us to be able to point to a scientific tool that uplifts what the community already knows, but isn't always supported by research was great to have. So there was this always discussion, what is environmental justice? You don't have a scientific methodology to funnel money into a quote unquote disadvantaged environmental justice community. And this was a major step after 15 years of fighting and finally getting it legislatively mandated to create this account viral screen.
So I think here in Michigan, we have the advantage that as we're starting the Healthy Climate Plan, it's written into it that a certain portion of the funds will be focused on EJ communities, right? And it's basically picking up with the Federal Justice 40 initiative and using the same sort of framework.
So yes, it is in the plan. And right now the plan is a plan. And we're working toward how implementation will work, how we integrate it. But it is that 40% is definitely based on Justice 40, which comes from the federal, mandates around making sure that 40% of monies that come from the federal government focus on disadvantaged communities as defined in that way. There is some leeway that states have on how and figuring out how to best integrate it, because I think that's where we are now, is in those stages of still learning more of how the federal requirements and how that will integrate into what we're trying to do at the state level. So I think that is an advantage, that all of this is coming together at the same time. Mm-hmm. And I think before implementation has truly coalesced, because there's opportunities for folks to be part of the process, advocate for what they want to see as part of how Michigan implements, Justice 40 and integrates it. I wanted to just add real quickly and kind of circle that back around to, Michael's follow-up about the fight in California. Environmental justice and the fight for environmental justice is really decades old. And it's the irony of hearing someone from California talk about the struggle is that a lot of folks here in Michigan that may have pushed back over the years on how we couldn't do stuff, they would say, we're not California, right? We can't do what California does. And to know there was a fight there, I want to be able to share that with some of the folks who say that. The role, that I have in terms of the public advocate is both internal and external, right? So a lot of that work is working with advocates on the outside, but it's also working within state government or through decades of traditional ways that things have been done to look at that a different way. And so I think as we work through Justice 40, as we work through other ways to get resources to communities, tools, because our tool was not legislatively created, beyond the recommendations of the task force, we also created the Michigan Advisory Council on Environmental Justice, which is a combination of frontline communities, representation from our 12 federally recognized tribes, business and industry, academia, a lot of different areas. Did I say labor? Labor are all coming together to make recommendations and to advise the state. And so that, as well as the response team working in consort, moved us forward. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah. So I was just thinking in terms of that years of laying the foundations and doing the work and the advocacy. One of the things we have going on right now in the state is the EJ community is stepping up and really pushing back about the power outages that we had during the recent ice storms. And Michelle, I know that MEJC and a lot of the organizations where you have deep ties over the Detroit community, they're on the front lines of this. They're the people at those MPSC, meetings. Could you talk a little about the issue and then sort of the background and how it is that you've your community has built this coalition of people who are now ready when the legislature is actually listening because we had this disaster.
Yeah,
And so they're ready to step up and do something and hopefully take advantage of this crisis, which we shouldn't have had to do, but.
Yeah, and thanks for that. I appreciate all the words about cumulative impact and also, the pressure and history of environmental justice communities and making sure that, we're really showing up in our wholeness, right? And I think it's really important, right? We have to contextualize Michigan in this industrial history, right? We've been producing cars for over 100 years, right? We have pipelines that are 60, 70 years old. I mean, sitting in Kalamazoo, we know that the Kalamazoo oil spill was the largest inland oil spill in American history. We have Enbridge that's still pumping oil from Canadian tar sands that comes down to Detroit. And so we're sort of all connected, right, through this energy infrastructure. And when we start talking about the utility side, we still have some of the oldest utility infrastructure in the United States. And when we started digging into the history a little bit, we also have an energy utility monopoly, and that monopoly is also nearly 100 years old, right? When we think that far back during the anti-monopoly age, right? In the 1930s, when we really started to bust up those big monopolies, the utilities had a special status that they were granted because they provided energy to the automotive industry that was so critically important during that interwar period. And so the entire regulatory system was set up around a guaranteed monopoly to produce power so that the industrial core of the United States, right, could continue to power through World War II. And that is a remarkable thing to think about in the context of 2023, when we know climate change is starting to rage on and getting exponentially more dangerous. Is the system that was built for a massive automotive industry the same kind of system that we need now? And so when we start asking questions about this, we need major structural change in our legislative and also our technical engineering environment and also in our social environment to pave the way for this new future, right? And what we're experiencing now is, I say, every time somebody blows the birthday candles out, right, the lights go out in Detroit. And a great report was actually done around utility redlining by We the People Michigan and MEJC. You can find it online. I'll put it in the chat box for our Zoomies. But what essentially happened, right, is that some of the oldest infrastructure is in the industrial core. And as suburbanization started to happen, newer technology was put in place. Well, that is deeply racialized in the Detroit metro area. And so you have people of color, Black residents, Latinx, Arab Americans, right? Poor communities in the Thumb have the oldest infrastructure, but suburban wealthier communities have the high voltage best infrastructure. Right. And so there's a racialized disparity in the access to reliable energy. The other piece is that income really is impacted in here, right? So we've found that folks who earn less have more power outages for longer and actually spend more of a proportion on their wages on energy. Not only that, the housing stock in our oldest communities is the least quality housing stock. So you have climate scientists like Karina Grunlin and others who are saying that, Detroit houses that were built in the 10s, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, they weren't built for the kind of heat that we're starting to experience in Michigan. So they actually act like little ovens, and the indoor air quality and temperature of a house at peak heat in Detroit is hotter than homes in Arizona because the architecture is just not ready and not prepared. So you have homes that can do peak heat at 110 indoor air quality. It's really astounding to think about the compounding impact, right? Now, we also have, and you probably know this, but Michigan is transitioning off a deep history of coal. We've relied on coal for a very, very long time. And the utilities have decided that their transition will be into nuclear and gas, which are not clean energy. right? The impacts of the life cycle, you probably all know, are incredibly difficult with fracking. We're talking now about different kinds of CCS, right? Pushing carbon into the ground to capture it. And so these sorts of technologies that are being proposed are not getting us to the kind of clean energy, and it's not problem solving sort of the deeply embedded disparities in the system that have been baked in for 100 years. So when EJ communities really started, they said, we want affordable energy. We also want clean energy, but we also want to be a part of the transition where the profit from the new system is not going to some faraway investor-owned utility in an offshore bank account. We want that profit to come back into our communities. So now we're seeing a huge push on all of that. Publicly owned energy in Ann Arbor, affordability in the State House, intervention at the MPSC, and EJ is on the front line. And that's true not only here in Michigan, but in Minnesota, in Illinois, in Wisconsin, in Pennsylvania, where industry has dominated for the last 100 years.
And I know whenever I see a report about the meeting of the Michigan Public Service Commission, I see familiar faces being quoted in the news articles when the reporters are there. I mean, it's people from the EJ community who are there talking about these issues, and they have this background knowledge so that they can come in and they can speak in the language that the committee understands, right? So that seems like it's part of that capacity building to actually build a group of people who can go and communicate with the committees, so that it's not just the utility that comes in with their special language, but the communities are able to both share the human story, but also to talk about the regulatory issues and the energy issues in a way that's kind of equals the playing field a little bit. Yeah.
No, I would agree that, and I think adding to what Michelle is saying is really this idea of, yes, climate change is the biggest existential threat facing our society, but at the same time, it's the greatest opportunity to rethink how our cities are built and how our communities are thriving or becoming more resilient. So this is an opportunity to reestablish infrastructure systems that are inequitable, have historic and racial histories of disinvestment, to ensure that these communities are being able to not only be protected and adapted to the threats, but also in a more sustainable multi-benefit policy. If we look at issues like flooding or extreme weather events, it's not just doing what they call gray infrastructure, hard kind of concrete infrastructure to support, or seawalls to support these, but how can we create more green spaces that not only provide recreational green spaces that help physical and mental health, but also provide opportunities to sequester a local air pollution at the same time, increase people's opportunity for more amenities in their local communities as well.
Yeah, and I'll piggyback on what you just said, and part of what Michelle said as well. You know, one of the really important pieces as we kind of embark on this new way to generate energy, these ways to address, climate change, has to do with making sure those who've had the most impact from the way our energy has been generated for 100 years also benefit from the economic opportunity that happens when we rethink how we, create energy. One of the things I think is real critical is the opportunity for folks in communities to be trained in some of the opportunities and jobs that will come with this new electrification future, with clean energy, with renewable energy. And I think the planning often says, oh, we'll make sure people will no longer, be impacted by coal, but are we saying, will they have benefit? Not just lessening impact, but also taking it to the next level of benefit. Because I think I hear over and over and over again about all these opportunities. And so I think it is really important for us to think about in all of our roles, how do we make sure there's economic benefit to communities, to individuals? So the health benefits are priority. but where are the economic benefits and are they built in? And I think as Michigan as a state moves forward and as, you know, across the country, I think that is a critical piece and something, you know, I often say in meetings, we have to be as intentional about incorporating that as we were in excluding folks from some of the benefits before. So you really do have to be intentional with that. You know, one of the things that is part of like my EJ screening tool, there are context layers. So there are layers that don't impact the score, but impact how you contextualize the information you're looking at. And one of those are redlining maps and the historical data around redlining maps, because oftentimes as we look at location, you know, environmental justice is all about location, where people live. And a lot of that was intentionally created over time by government policy, by a lot of different things. And so understanding that context so it's not repeated, I think is really critical to moving us forward.
So are there any examples from California that would be really good case studies of where that kind of intention and attention to justice really played out well? I'm all about the stories.
But in terms of intentionality around justice issues?
Yeah,
Well, I think this idea of Justice 40, you know, California, and when they created the cow and viral screen, attached it to what was locally known as the Climate Community Benefits Fund, where they were taking climate investments and at the time putting 25% of climate investments into disadvantaged communities, or DACs, as DC also uses. A couple years later, that was expanded to 35%, and in actuality, in recent analyses, it's well over 50% goes into local environmental justice communities, not just benefiting local communities, but directly invested. So that was done again through a forced method, where again the legislature was changing and demographics. A lot of the old big names in environmentalism, from particularly from coastal and northern California, were retiring. African American, Latino legislators, and Asian legislators were coming in from environmental justice communities, having that background and sponsoring this type of legislation and forcing the administration as well as regulatory agencies that did not want to do that. There was a lot of pushback within regulatory environmental agencies that felt more that any air quality policy should benefit everyone, and specific groups should not be targeted. It's sort of this very utilitarianism approach, the greatest good for the greatest number. So that was the refrain over and over in civil servant regulatory scientist positions that and the board itself did not want to do that until they were forced legislatively to do that. So it's all about the mandate and all about the budget mandate as well. So once that kind of came in, so that really showed the organizing power of understanding that you can't just protest at City Hall, at the state capitol, outside the state capitol, or even at the United Nations. You have to, be there every day in the face of the legislators, developing coalitions, and also extending that to, as I mentioned, having an inside-outside campaign and strategically getting environmental justice or strong equity-minded folks with the scientific training and these key positions, both at the staff level and the regulatory gubernatorial appointments. It was important. So cow and viral screen, what we know of Justice 40 at the federal level, all came through this very complex mix of inside-outside tactics that put a strong force, if you will, an equity lens on climate change policy.
So this seems like a perfect setup for me to ask, since we're educators and we're training students to go out who maybe will want to get involved in advocacy work at the community level, or maybe want to go work for Regina in her office and figure out how to be part of the government side of things, what would be your recommendations for some of the key skills or experiences, the background that we should help our students develop so they can be part of this work going forward. And also maybe we as faculty could cultivate in our own lives so we can be good citizens.
I think experience is it, getting in there, right? And I tell students that, you know, environmental justice is not a spectator sport. You have to really roll up your sleeves, pick up the phone, call people, go, you know, do the interview, go do the internship, go into the field, and don't be afraid of messing up, but take responsibility, right, for your own role and start to build the kind of relationships with people in the communities with whom you're going to be working, because relationship is the real resource that keeps our environmental justice communities sound and together, right? And the kinds of skills in environmental justice that we're really starting to hone in, and for faculty who are teaching Gen Z, right, are experiential learners, and I'm learning this quite quickly, right, that folks want that experience, right? And the mentorship is so crucial for students. And so here at Tishman, what we do is we not only set up internships, but we also have weekly meetings with students to say, hey, how is this landing with you? What are you learning this week? What did, you know, this community member say? What happened when you engaged with this legislature? How are you taking these complex ideas about earth-based care and starting to weave them into these new ideas that you're advancing, right? Because that mentorship piece is so much about the unknowing. And what I'm realizing about students now is that, you know, this thing, you can't see it, or it's a cell phone that I'm waving around, moderates so much of folks' relationships and their attention, right?
Mhm.
And so the generational understanding about the operationalizing of these things is very, very different than how legislators, regulators, and community members understand change, right? And so pulling these realities into one sort of thing, it provides this awesome, really cool, innovative space. But again, unless we understand that context, they'll turn off. They will just close it down, be like, this is too hard, this is too complex. And so for educators, I'm like, stay in the fire with them, you know? And for educators, I also think that extending to provide mentorship, like what I'm learning, and this, you know, like I'm supporting the union, like the institution doesn't provide us with like a lot of space or incentive to do the kinds of mentorship that is needed, you know? And so the more we talk about what that is, I think the higher the value of it can be. So we can argue in departments and on university campuses that the mentorship network, Sibel, that you've created, right? That co-mentoring, coming together as human beings, learning together, doing things together is actually how we learn. So I think the more and more we can come together around these complex ideas to sort of struggle together through them is super important. And, you know, send your undergraduates over here. We're recruiting master's students all the time, and we're working on developing out like what EJ means at higher education levels and building out more and more structures. So just glad to continue to work together on it.
And I think I'll piggyback on what Michelle said. I said, learning from people with lived experience, you can't replace that, because you may read about it, you may read a book, you may watch a video, but there is nothing like going to your first community meeting, hearing people tell you what they've been through, what their lives have been. That was a big part of my learning on environmental justice. So I've been a lifelong advocate. I started out when I was kind of I'm so old that they called it junior high school back then. It wasn't middle school, it was junior high, right? So when I was in junior high, I grew up in the 70s, and you know, there was a really strong Black Power movement in my community. I grew up in East Cleveland, Ohio, kind of it's one of the poorest communities in Ohio right now. They've had a lot of disinvestment, a lot of loss, very similar, very industrial. Ohio and Michigan share that industrial, past. But back then there was this, thriving, and I would see like, Black Panther movement folks like marching in the streets, and Black nationalists marching in the streets. And my mom would be like, stay in the house. Don't go outside. I don't want you to get hurt. I don't want you to get in trouble. And I would sneak out of the house, join the movement. I went to this place called the Unity House, and they were telling me all about these things. And I come home and I go, Mom, did you know this and this and this were going on? And she said, I thought I told you not to go. And so there was something in me that needed to go find out experientially what was happening. And I think, when it comes to what kind of experience, there is the theory and all of it that you will learn in an academic setting, but there is nothing like action on the ground. I have this kind of continuum of change that I talk about, and I think it starts with agitation. Like, Michael mentioned, some of that in California. You bring attention to an issue, but then you got to figure out what you're advocating for. And once you figure out what you're advocating for, you take the attention that you've gotten and make an ask, go in, then you negotiate with whoever you have to negotiate with. Some of it is collaboration, some of it is negotiation, some of it is working with government, some of it is working with companies, some of it is all of the above. And I think the role and space that you want your life to play in that continuum of change, you could do all of it. If you want to agitate and bring attention to things, I mean, there are marches in the streets, or there are, more direct advocacy things that I know some folks like to get into, or there are opportunities to just do things like write letters and, do editorial. It's action. So I think figuring out where, and you might do all of it. I think some people can do it all. One of the things I like to talk about is the fact that people don't realize that in that continuum of change, agitator, advocate, and then negotiator, people always think that Martin Luther King was like a negotiator, that he had a dream and then he went and sat down with that no, he was an agitator from the beginning. And so I always use that example because I like for people to think about how in their lives they will evolve and what roles they can play and change. And I think that lends itself to, I started out as a communicator, as a journalist, and sharing information about these issues. And then I wanted to be more involved and got more involved in more the advocacy space. And, for affordable housing and other issues, always caring about climate. And then when I got into working for Sierra Club and the Beyond Coal campaign, it really opened up my knowledge around the impact that coal plants are really having on communities. And I think that's the piece that once you get into it, you'll find your space and place. So I don't know if there's any one way. I know you pointed out that all of us have arts degrees, right? From the very beginning, because you have to be able to make a case. You have to be able to take research and data and make it not just data. I think, Michael, you made a point about those who work in like regulatory agencies and who are, the technical folks and engineers and the regulators who think very linear, right? And you have to push your way in there to think, okay, you can't just think, if I do this, this will happen, right? You have to think more broadly about it. So I think it's really important to have that broader view and bring that broader view to spaces and places maybe where it doesn't exist now. Like I will tell you, when I first started this position, having been an advocate before starting this position, I would walk into meetings with people and say, if I ever yelled at you at a hearing, I'm sorry. So I need to work with you now, because there were people that I did yell at, maybe, in these meetings. And so I think, we need people who have a different perspective in places that have traditionally had a very monolithic way of looking at things. We need people of color. We need people with creative backgrounds. We need advocates. We need people who see things not in a linear way, in regulatory spaces, in companies, in organizations, in utilities, in these industrial spaces, to help change the narrative. So that would be kind of my advice. That was a long answer, but I just had to share all that. So.
But it came with a good story.
You like stories, so that's good.
No, I think that's excellent too. So I mentioned I've spent well over a decade in the legislature or in external affairs, public advocacy work. But now over the last couple of years, I'm a gubernatorial appointee to the State Regional Water Quality Control Board. So we look at water quality, enforcing the Clean Water Act for the Los Angeles and Ventura County regions, 11 million people. But in either working in the legislature or working as an appointee in that position is always having the need to have agitators, like as you mentioned. And I think that maybe that sounds negative, but advocates that are pushing the envelope, let me reframe that, are pushing the envelope and demanding that you do more. Because oftentimes, even if you have the best of intentions and really equity-minded board members or commissioners or policymakers, they have to be able to show some support that or pressure that is coming externally, and that there's a base out there that really wants this issue, and policymakers themselves can point to that, can be able to use that to persuade others within the organization that this is needed and there's a demand for that. So that goes again to that inside outside kind of idea, and really ensuring that we have that diversity of opinions. And we're not going to always agree, but being able to get pushed is important.
So one question that's been entered online comes from Joan Hawkshurst, and she asks, what role have you seen local faith communities play in successful environmental justice organizing?
So I would say in almost every situation, faith leaders, faith institutions have played a really critical role, whether they are conveners, whether they are the folks speaking up in both environmental advocacy and housing advocacy when I was there, and now in environmental justice. I think it's really critical. You know, the interesting part about kind of the Office of Environmental Justice is we cover the whole state. And so, you know, there are situations where we will come into a community, and a lot of you know, my experience prior to this position had been very Southeast Michigan focused, right? It had been Detroit advocacy. I've been working with EJ communities in Detroit, even though I covered, you know, the whole state where EJ was really front and center, was kind of the eastern and southern part of the state. So when you enter a new community, the best way, I think, to figure out what's going on is to work with faith institutions and to figure out, you know, who's in the community, and they can be important allies, or they can also stand in sometimes as they can be allies to the work, and they can also bring a trust level for some folk who may not trust people from the outside to come and learn. So I think they play a really important role. And I've seen that over the years, where once you bring a trusted, you know, pastor or someone into the priest, someone into the conversation, sometimes it brings other folks along with them.
Yeah, this is an interesting question, because, you know, my instinct is that when we entered the water crisis, both in the shutoffs and at the Flint water crisis, it were faith leaders who said, what kind of world do we live in that people don't have water in their homes, right? What kind of people are we if we don't believe that somebody should have fresh water? And so we had amazing pastors, faith leaders come together and, you know, put their bodies in the streets, block traffic, right? And that was a really powerful testament. You know, on the other hand, I've seen and been a part of meetings and formations where I've entered into rooms where congregations have been mobilized to maintain the status quo. And that's so hard. Because in the case of utilities, for example, DTE Energy Foundation hands out hundreds of millions of dollars in grants, and it's been covered in the media. And unfortunately, they also hold the purse strings on some of the necessary and critical resources that are distributed for low income energy efficiency and energy assistance programs. And so when you have implementers who are implicated, right, in the system that is necessary and life-saving, they're there to protect that and support that. But, you know, as advocates, we're there to say, hey, you know, assistance is not affordability. We want to reset the rate structures so that you never pay over 6% of your income, regardless of what you make. That's not the same as getting a $30 or $70 bill credit. That's not the same as getting an apportionment of energy or water in your home. That's not affordability. And so it puts us across the picket line sometimes, and that is very uncomfortable. And so we do see a political, but we do see a moral, you know, way that people show up, and it's important to know the difference.
Yeah, I would like to, I think those are both great responses. It is like a mixed bag, like any community or constituency, it's a mixed bag of actors, faith-based community. And that example of the polar bear and the Oakland Climate Action Coalition, that was a multi organization or coalition that included faith leaders and that were advocating strong for an equity perspective on climate action. But in other aspects, like the new research I'm doing in climate-induced disasters and impacts to LGBTQ communities, some of the key disaster providers, part of the disaster infrastructure nationally and more importantly locally, are some of the big religious organizations that don't necessarily have the greatest reputation with LGBTQ communities. Salvation Army, for one, others that are changing and are changing, but LGBTQ people, you know, remember that and could possibly be triggered or discriminated on in a shelter or disaster services provided by a faith-based organization. So it's very important that FEMA, that's what the conversations we're having. We just had a webinar on this earlier this week with FEMA, is ensuring that faith-based organizations are a key part of disaster recovery, but there's also secular options, or more inclusive disaster faith-based organizations. So in my course of my research, I've met some very progressive churches that are inclusive and really have come out in this disaster space to really go out of their way to show how welcoming they are. And then on the other hand, similar to what Michelle was saying, is really understanding, again, a theological worldview about the environment and natural resources. If we think back of the idea of abundance and man's dominion by God over earth, infinite amount of resources that man or humankind can find a technological solution because we were gifted this land. So that's called in political science, it's called a cornucopian approach to environmental policy, infinite amount of resources, technological fix, because we have dominion over this land. So ensuring that as we enter the climate sphere, that we have religious leaders, you know, Pope Francis, which is encyclical on climate change, it's an important step a couple of years ago to say that this should be front and center. And climate change, climate action is in line with God's teaching, and we see other religious leaders that are also doing that. So again, it's a mixed bag, just like any other community, but more needs to be done.
Yeah, I would just add one thing that we'll be remiss if we don't mention, which is that, you know, Indigenous tribal leaders all over the continental United States, known as United States, have been really leading, right? Not only do Indigenous peoples steward 80% of the world's most biodiverse geographies, also have been on the front lines of water protecting because of the traditional teachings that are coming. So that's oftentimes we think of, oh, faith leaders as being the Brimic religions, but we also have a very rich tradition of Indigenous theologies and worldviews that have been on the front lines on making sure that we understand what protecting Earth means in the context of Indigenous leadership.
Yeah, thank you for that. We've had a question from one of our scholars here asking if if Mike could talk a little more about his LGBTQ research.
Great. Yeah, I'll touch on it really quickly because I know we have a few minutes left. This idea really started in when I was teaching at the Yale School of Environment, and in my environmental justice class, where a great student, Leo Goldsmith, who's now working on the National Climate Assessment in Washington, D.C., presented his research, emerging research on what is going on with LGBTQ communities and climate disasters in the United States. So it was something there. It had a grain of this innovative work. Obviously, it was a student class paper. It needed a lot of work, but we kind of started. I approached him afterwards. He identifies as a trans Latinx individual. I identify as a gay Latinx individual, and we started to work on how can we do one of the first. We believe it's the first state of the field in the United States on what is happening to LGBTQ communities throughout the state. There's been other studies more in the international perspective, where like a very snapshot of one disaster like Hurricane Katrina, but not looking systematically throughout the United States, from looking at discriminatory existing federal policies to those faith-based that I mentioned, to understanding that social vulnerability does include the diverse populations of LGBT. Oftentimes we think of LGBT communities as being white, wealthy, and male. So what they call the myth of gay affluence, but understanding that nearly 40% of LGBTQ people identify themselves as people of color. And many of those people of color, unfortunately, are low income. Many of them have housing insecurity, and some of the same very elements and attributes that we provide to social vulnerability, most specifically intersectionality, that these people are LGBT, and some could be transgender, low income, African American, or Latino. So we're really emphasizing this intersectional lens that LGBTQ people are people of color. They could be low income and socially vulnerable as well, and being able to open the doors in our policy world and having discussions about that. So that's what we're working on. If you Google FEMA helping LGBTQ communities, you can see the webinar that just happened on Tuesday with several of the FEMA leaders. And there's another one happening next month. So just Google that and you'll be able to find the webinar.
Thank you. So we had one other question came in online, specifically bringing up that we have an issue here in Kalamazoo whereby the graphic packaging plant on the northeast side of our town has been expanding, and the smell was bad before it expanded, and now it's exponentially worse. And of course, it's contiguous with our sewer treatment plant. So there's a mix of smells. And of course, this is on the north side where we have a history of redlining, majority Black community, low income, older housing. So in the summer, people are going to have their windows open because they need to for fresh air and breathing. They may not have air conditioning. And besides, anyone should be able to open their window and have fresh air. And so the question was raised whether, specifically they asked how EGLE was going to deal with that. That's obviously overly precise. But I'm just thinking about the discussion that's gone on here about recognizing that where there's already a disproportionate burden because of air quality. This is also not too far from the river, so it's a little bit low lying. With the new EJ screen map that we have here in Michigan, is this the sort of place where we could see the possibility of bringing together some of these new community healthy climate planning efforts to essentially address multiple issues simultaneously around building a more climate resilient community? Does that sound like the perfect place to do some of this healthy climate work?
No, that's a very positive way of looking at the opportunities before us, because as we've talked about before, we are a state filled with industry. And I know there are some real specific challenges in Kalamazoo, Benton Harbor, Flint, Detroit, other communities. And so I absolutely get the question and understand. Thank you for rescuing me from the what will EGLE do, because there's a lot of things that are in the works, a lot of things that have been done, a lot of things that still need to be done. So I don't have a precise answer for that exactly. But looking at what are the impacts of some of the things that you just mentioned on the health of folks in the north end of Kalamazoo, on all of these things, the treatment plant, the graphics packaging, all the things that could impact health. Are we really looking at what those impacts are? That's one of the things that my office is trying to champion, not just in Kalamazoo, but in other parts of the state as well, because that is a repeated request, right? Advocates, and folks in communities often, sometimes it is, direct health issues that they've seen. Sometimes it is the smells, and it's always an opportunity to do that, but we haven't done it a lot in Michigan in terms of the health impacts, really analyzing that. And the bigger conversation around how do we look at cumulative impacts, I think is a national conversation that's really important. I say all that to say we are looking to ramp up in Kalamazoo and in other areas. If there are ways that we can do a more in-depth look at what's impacting health, beyond the regulatory framework that, sometimes, and this is the challenge of my job, I'll be honest, and the challenge of how we regulate from the government space in terms of impact is one thing at a time, right? It is not how it all comes together. And that's often how people experience it, right? If you have you mentioned it, you said if there is, something coming from one facility, something coming from another facility, even if it's a smell, how do we better address those? And so, no real answer on all of the fix, but looking at health impacts is one way we're trying to move forward from the perspective of in, Kalamazoo, maybe Flint, parts of Detroit. How do we look at all of these things together to see what the health impacts are and hopefully have that impact us in policy moving forward? Right now, we can't change the regulation on our own. Part of the conversation about what legislators can do or what Congress can do or what the federal government can do, but we can look at what are the impacts and how to address those as we figure the rest of that out. So
Right.
That would be my answer to that.
Thank you. Yeah. And Michelle put in the chat the hotline to call for reporting, and noted that documenting those things every time they happen is really, really important. And one of the things that we do have going forward is there are now a lot more monitors that are being set up. So we should have more information about, because a smell means there's something in the air. We need to know more about what the things in the air actually are. Yeah. Well, we're coming to the end of our time. Any last comments, thoughts that you would like to share with our audience today? And this has been a wonderfully rich conversation. The time just flew by.
Thanks. I'm just reminding folks to bug your legislators constantly about affordable, clean, renewable energy. We have big bills that are coming down the pike, and we need everybody all over the state to be bugging their legislatures that we need to fix the system so that we can get climate justice.
Again, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you to Regina and Michelle. I've never met both of you, but when I saw your bios early on, I'm like, got really excited. So really glad we had to have opportunity to have this more in-depth conversation. And I think the biggest takeaway for me is this theme of communication, stories, narrative, humanizing climate change, operationalizing it in our streets and our neighborhoods. And telling stories can also be scientifically based. So understanding that we can have climate change that's scientifically sound, but also socially robust. So as Michelle said, I keep on with the advocacy and the action at multiple levels. Thank you.
So I'll just echo the thank you. This was a good conversation. It really went by really, really quickly. Although Michelle and I knew each other, I had not had the opportunity to meet you, Michael, and I am really impressed with the work that you're engaged with right now as well as, the interest for students at Western and faculty at Western. I think that is a really important space and place where, you know, one of the things, I say my office as if there's a lot of us, there's only like 3 of us. We're looking to grow and we're covering the whole state. But I think it's really important to continue to elevate things to the point that you know, you've heard before with your legislature, with, you know, whether it's with EGLE or any other department, making sure that you're sharing what you're experiencing. Because, you know, the one of the things before I got into government, I used to go, why do things take so long? And now that I'm in government, I totally get it. There are so many layers and so many things to get through. And so sometimes things get lost. And so it's really important, you know, to continue to advocate and to continue to be part of that conversation. You know, make sure you have good examples, make sure you can tell the stories, and make sure you work with people. Real quick aside, I was talking to a corporate group who will remain nameless, but the reason anyway, one of the things they said is, we're going to go to these communities and we're going to do a cleanup effort. I said, so when you go to the community, are you just showing up, or are you actually going to the community and talking to people in the community, maybe inviting them to join you or have these conversations? And they were like, wow, we never thought of that. That's a really good idea. And so I think there are many levels of engagement that I just would encourage all of you to find ways to be part of and ask hard questions, even if there aren't answers. Sometimes it spurs a thought process. So thank you again, you know, looking forward to opportunities to continue to engage moving forward.
So I want to thank you for giving us permission to follow through on the other advice we got to be good advocates. So now we know the government just invited us to harass them.
You know, there are so many people who don't need an invitation. That's the other piece. There is just, you know, Michigan's a big state. There's like 10 million people, and you know, there's so many important things. And one of the things that is always hard is how to address it all, right? And so, but please share, you know, that is why we're here, to serve. You know, and it's not always easy, but it's part of the job. So yes.
Great. Yeah, so this is such a wonderful moment for us here in Michigan with the Healthy Climate being developed and now being implemented. And so thank you so much for helping us understand better how we can engage and be part of helping to move this forward. And let's all just a round of applause for this. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right.
Great night.
Thank you.